First of all, thank you everyone for coming along again. As I said before a couple of you arrived, we had Curly Saunders was going to be doing it, and she unfortunately had to pull out. Next month we're going to have Rawa Arja, who is one of our WestWords fellows, who has a new book just come out, and she's going to be talking about all sorts of things. Then I guess we'll try and get Curly on later in the piece at some point. But as I said, it was very generous of Isobelle, Dr. Isobelle Carmody, to jump in for us. Got a couple of other people. Kendi, hello, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Good. And Alicia, I can't see you, but hello. And oh, hello.
Hi.
There you go. And Belinda as well. And Belinda, you're a television writer, I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, factual stuff though. Sort of documentary, science, medical type television series mostly. Sometimes kids, just recently kids, but still factual rather than fiction or drama. But yes.
Yeah, okay. So, and I invited you along today because we were talking about something else, and I just happened to mention that this was happening. So I invited you, and you're here. So we're very glad to have you here, Suzanne and Jennifer. And have I missed anyone? No, I think that's.
Change my name.
Oh, I'm James. I'm from WestWords, as most of you know. And Isobelle Carmody. Now, I could just read the thing I have here that is Curly's bio, but
yeah, go ahead.
So, Isobelle Carmody, you're going to have to introduce yourself. The things I do know about Isobelle is that she's a pretty heavy hitter in the world of fantasy. She's been writing since you were, I think your first book, were you 16, something like that, when your first book was written? Or
14, turgid, totally turgid.
Sorry. And I say this, I was saying to someone earlier, and I say this in all honesty, Isabelle's one of my favourite people. She's a really lovely person, and it's really nice of you to join us. So, Isobelle, I'll let you talk about whatever you want to talk about. The floor is yours, and of course, anytime anyone has any questions, just sort of wave and or hold them to the end or whatever. You don't have to talk for the whole night, but if you want to, we're more than happy to listen. So, fire away, Isobelle Carmody.
Okay, well, since you introduced me with the fantasy angle, I suppose I will begin by talking a little bit about the PhD, because why does a writer bother to undertake a PhD? I mean, I was doing well enough as a writer. I'm not doing any better. I won't do any better because of having done my PhD. My mum said, so what now? And it's like, what are you going to do when you grow up? And, you know, I don't see anything much changing about my life. I had my reasons for doing it, and they were not to get tenure as a university professor, or really even to work in universities. To begin with, what I was looking for was some kind of gravitas as a human being, so that when I was on a panel with people who were not fantasy writers, I would be able to slug back in their language, and I would be able to say what I wanted to say about what I do in a language that they would understand, or that they would, you know, heavy enough and grounded enough in their kind of language. So I wanted that. Because you write fantasy, and someone said if you write romance, it's further down the track. Children's literature, you know, okay, literary children's fiction, that's fine, but you're still, you know, you're not considered to be doing the real thing, which is writing literary adult novels. So I guess I wanted to defend what I was doing, and you know, it's a genre I love, but I don't set out to write genre writing ever. I never have. I set out to write something, and it's always somehow been that it's as if the idea looks for a vessel, and for me that vessel has been very often the fantasy and the fantastic. And you know, I wanted to look at why I did that. I wanted to think about, and I've done it with pieces of writing, I wanted to think about why, you know, when I wrote Darkfall and Dark Song, I was looking at, you know, if a world can be rescued, and it's a fantasy world, and it can be rescued by, you know, releasing a unicorn, what about the real world? What's the use of that to the real world? It's just, it doesn't mean anything in the real world. It's symbolic, but what does it symbolize actually? What can save the real world? What can help the real world in the ways that those things help in fiction? So I wanted to look at in that. So when I wrote those novels, I was really looking at why have a dragon? Why have a, you know, unicorn? Why not just write about heroism in reality? There's plenty of it around. There must be a reason. Why do we go to those things? And so when I wrote Darkfall and Dark Song, I was making my own creative examination of those ideas. And looking back now, I can see I was doing it a number of times in a number of ways. When I wrote Greylands, when I was always looking at why am I doing this? So to do a PhD, that was one of the reasons. There were also sort of sound financial reasons for it too. I'd been living for 10 years in Prague. I wanted to come back to Australia. I wanted my daughter to have her last 3 years of school in English. I wanted her to feel that, you know, the groundedness you feel when you're speaking your own language, instead of always being slightly on the back foot. I wanted her to feel sort of really strong in her own language when she was finishing school. And I had no money. The bottom had fallen a bit out of literature. And I thought at first it was just, I got a terrible royalty. I thought it was a glitch. And then there was another glitch another 6 months later. And I thought, oh my God, I guess this could be real. Maybe it really has changed. And maybe I can't make a living out of writing, which I'd done for most of, I mean, I was the breadwinner of my family. And for most of my life, I had no money problems. So I realized things had changed, and but I still wanted to go home. So I had spoken on tour to another writer, and that was Kim Wilkins. And she said, Isobelle, why don't you, this was years back. She said, why don't you think about a creative PhD? And I said, I can't do a PhD. I've only done an undergraduate, you know, I didn't do any more degrees. I didn't do an honours year. And she said, we can just skip over those because of your body of work. And that seemed kind of, I thought, wow, that's cool, but I don't want to do that. So I just put it out of my mind. But when I was coming back to Australia and thinking where I wanted to live, I thought, what if I could do it? So I wrote to her and thought, well, what if I could get a scholarship? And if I could study, I'd love that. And then I'd be able to live. So I wrote to her and she said, oh my God, you know, do it at the University of Queensland because I can supervise you. But you have to apply and, you know, postgrad, it's hard to get the grant, the scholarship. So I went through all the hoops and I got accepted. And what I got accepted with was wanting to pursue that same question. I wanted to ask something about how is it, I don't want to talk about fantasy worlds. I actually want to talk about reality. I always and only want to talk about reality. So if that's the case, how, you know, I want to talk about why and how. And I wanted to look at the exact mechanisms I used. And I won Book of the Year twice with things that were fantastical. So and I believe they spoke to and about the real world. So I sort of wanted to step back from that and think about what literally is the mechanism I used when I write. What are the most powerful mechanisms? Which one will I choose? And I'd never really thought very much about what I was doing. I guess you have this mystical approach to your writing. You don't want to think too much about the mechanisms because what if it all goes away once you start thinking about it? So there was all that sort of weird superstitious stuff, but I decided not to care about that. And so I thought I would, so I chose an aspect of my own creative toolbox to write about. And what that technique was when I looked at my writing, I thought, what do I do when I want to write most profoundly about reality, when I want to answer the deepest questions in every book? What is it what's my go-to? Why do I always end up writing almost always something fantastical? And I picked this technique I use, and I had to figure out what it was first. And it's something to do with, it's an oscillation between realism and the fantastic. So realism is really important when you write fantasy. You use realism. And when you say a book is a fantasy novel, you're talking about that as a genre. I wanted to use it as a writer uses these terms, and that is as a tool. And so for me, I don't use fantasy as a receptacle into which to fit myself. I use it as a tool, and I don't just use one. If you look at literature, you can see that people often use both realism and the fantastic when they write. I mean, look at Cloud Street. He's writing realism. But you look at Cloud Street, there's an aspect of Cloud Street where one of the characters, I mean, I'm sure you've all read it, and I'm just going to be a spoiler if you haven't. His character is split apart when they drown into a person that's real and still living with some kind of diminished mental state. But the other part of them, the bit of them that's gone, that was lost, is still floating in the story. I mean, that's fantasy. That's pure fantastic. And if you look at, Midnight's Children, you look at all sorts of writing, not just magical realism, not just hard fantasy, but all sorts of novels use flutterings of fantasy. And many times I wanted to talk about death and grieving. And you know how when we write novels, I mean, those of you who write will know this anyway, but when you write novels, you have your own creative thesis you're pursuing. And so underneath everything that you're writing, there are various questions you're asking. So my question for the novel that I was writing as part of my PhD, my question was, isn't our grieving over death, isn't that really actually grieving for ourselves most, in a very profound way? Because when we die, that's the end of cognition. We can never process our own death except in advance and, by means of other people dying. That's how we process death, and it's the only way we can process it. And I believe we must process it in some way, and we can't just do it once. That's why grieving is these waves of grief that come, because it's a mechanism for processing our own mortality. So what I wanted to write in the novel, I wanted to examine the process of grieving. And so the novel is this gigantic mammoth thing called The Theatre of Death. Kim said I wrote 4 PhDs in one, because I wrote an overlength thesis and I wrote an overlength novel. And I applied and I basically said, what do you expect? You took me on as a creative writer. Take a look at the books that I've written. And that's what I do sometimes. And I don't know how long a thing will be, because I have to be allowed to pursue that question to its end. A good editor will be able to hack it to pieces afterwards, maybe. But right now, this is what I'm doing. So that was what I wanted to look at then, how I as a writer would then deal with that question creatively. So my idea was to write a novel where I had dozens of characters, every part. I did everything I ever wanted to do that a publisher would be horrified by. I wrote it through the eyes of dozens of characters. I put myself in it as myself, as an ethnographer, wandering around interviewing my own characters in the middle of a very dramatic story in which it's partly murder mystery, partly saga. There's a woman who's comatose the whole time, who's dreaming. It's like about a dozen stories all wound together. It's mad. Many times when I was writing it, I just thought, this is crazy. How will I ever get to the end? Well, I knew what the end was. I knew everything about the novel. I just didn't know. It was just so huge to get there through all these different, and having myself, I had such fun wandering around in my own novel. At some point, I just got sick of the story and I wandered off and started talking to someone, and the story's gone in one direction and I've gone in the other. I just really, really loved every bit of it. And at the same time, I was writing about this, making this exploration, looking at my characters, judging them, and I was there for them to interact with too. So every now and again they would judge me, or they would, especially the kids, would have conversations with me that was slightly eerie. So I had this notion that, maybe kids could see through me more realistic, because kids see through a lot. So I decided that was how I was going to work it. And outside of this, my research consisted of trying to watch myself do this. So I had notebooks, and all the time that I was writing, all the time that I was researching, because I researched, the family set up a funeral parlour. And so I had to research all the ways, what do you do with the body? What are all the possible things you can do with the body? Is it legal? What's the legality of it? How would they do it? And I went to dozens of parties, and I was the person sitting in the corner saying to someone, so how did your Aunt Maud die? Now, all I was interested in was hearing people's stories about death, and everybody has them. Weird wills people left, weird requirements, weird companies set up to do weird things. Like there's someone sent me, and I keep getting information because even though I've finished my PhD, information flows towards you that you've set up. And I think for years from now, weird death stuff is going to be coming to me. And one of the things was that came to me was recently, there's a guy you can pay after you die, and he just pops up at your death, at your not at your death, at your graveside when everybody's mourning, and reveals things about you that you wanted revealed. So yeah, so and there are many things like how people can be buried. So I did a lot of research, and while I was researching, I was constantly trying to be an ethnographer and observe myself. And I had ethnographic notes. So I had moments in which I made notes. I always made note whenever I sat down to write. Before I wrote, I would write for 5 minutes talking about what was in my mind, what I had just been doing, what I had for breakfast, who had told me what I'd noticed in the sky. And then afterwards I'd write about, what I did that day. Did I go where I thought I was going to go? Did I go off did someone call? Did I get angry? Did I get stuck? And I kept those notes and dated them. And when I was researching, I had post-it notes. And as I was researching, any time any thought about the book came into my mind, especially about fantasy and realism, anything that came into my mind, I would just stop, write it down in the shortest form possible and stick it on the page of the book that I was writing. And at the end of that day, I would put all those pieces of post-it notes in an envelope and date them. So I did a lot. And then later on, I called that data. I also wrote weekly, where that's what you do as an ethnographer. You take all of your notes that you're examining whatever you're examining. You try to process them to the next level. You try to notice things. You notice that on this, one of the things I noticed was, and these were such interesting things. I noticed that if I'd had a conversation about writing with another writer, I tended to be much more able to process, to say clearly what I wanted to say. It was as if I'd got into that mind state. And I noticed, and I also had this weird thing where I had to write about writing when not writing, because as writers, the time in which you sit down to actually write is only a very small portion of the process of creation. You're thinking about it when you're having an argument with your wife, you're laying in bed at night and you can't sleep, you go to the loo, you go walking down the street, you're waiting in a supermarket queue. Things come to you that are connected to your writing. So I had post-it notes with me all the time, and they're everywhere. I keep finding them in weird places that I forgot, stuck to the back of my arm because I've got them inside a coat or something. My whole life is full of these weird post-it notes, only some of which I was able to cull. But in trying to just, every time I noticed stuff, to write it down. And what I found was that some of the most fruitful thinking about writing happened when I was doing the dishes, or, I noticed that then I would have a notepad beside and I'd be stirring the pot and I'd think about something and I'd stir a bit more. So those really kind of mindless, not that cooking is mindless, but those moments of just doing that kneading of dough or whatever it was that you're doing, those were the moments. I tried doing it with audio, but it was incredibly lengthy and I was very blabby, as you know, as you can tell. And I just didn't want to transcribe my notes. So I thought, nah, that's a bad idea, because that's going to be weeks and years of blabbing that I'm going to have to listen to. So the post-it notes worked really well. Did you want to say something about my blabbiness?
Yeah, no, I just wanted, no, not at all. I just wanted to say that my dad's 80 and he's currently working on his second PhD. But I remember when he was doing his first one when I was at school, he used to do all his thinking in the shower.
Shower.
That's what he told us he was doing anyway. And he'd suddenly shout out, "Somebody write this down!" And we'd all have to scramble and find a pen and write stuff down. And in the end, I think he installed a whiteboard or something in the shower so that he could write these things, because that's where all his best thoughts came, apparently.
Oh yeah, me too. But I have to say, I tend, until this PhD, I almost wrote nothing down, and there's a reason for doing that. Like every writer I know keeps a notebook. So one of the chapters in my PhD is studying the process of notebooking, and I was looking at ethnographic note taking as an anthropologist or an ethnographer, and and the kind of notebooking that creative writers do. So I looked at 3 people who notebooked, and various different kinds of writers, and I really examined their process of notebooking. And my process was it was about gathering data. It wasn't a creative note-taking exercise. It was very interesting because when I was first looking at notebooking, I've got friends who are writers, of course, and I asked quite a lot of them, can I look at your notebook? And in every single case, they said, no way. I mean, in every case. And I realised when I tried to keep notes that personal stuff gets in there. Of course it does. And so, they're extremely personal. And although my notebook wasn't that much so, it still processes a lot of personal stuff. So I was looking at notebooking, and that's one of the chapters of the, you have to write your exegetical essay around and about your piece of writing. So, yeah, I've seen it pop up. Jenny, did you want to say something?
I was just saying I'm not a writer, but my ideas come when I'm trying to get to bed at night. I can't sleep, and ideas just keep going through my head all the time. And at one stage I tried to put a notebook and pencil by my bed, but then I'm waking up more to do that.
Exactly.
So I just have to then tell myself as I'm trying to go to sleep, now remember this in the morning, and then I do.
Well, I think, see, again, it is a strategy for me not to write things down, because I think a lot of creative energy as a writer is wasted in, I would say it's wasted in writing really, really complex notes. And I mean, I don't mean for experienced writers. Of course, people have their own methods once they're experienced, but, emerging writers, beginning writers often write really, really long notes, especially in fantasy or science fiction. They'll world build it all into notes, and they've put so much of themselves into it. They've got nothing left for the piece of creative writing. It's boring to them because they've sort of solved the thing that's the question that's driving the piece of writing. They've already solved it. And so for me, I just believe I'll remember it. I mean, we do remember an incredible amount of stuff. We can't access it. And I think if you've got an idea that's strong enough, it will just drag all that stuff out of you. And for me, that process of writing is going over and over and over the piece of writing. And it does come up, lots of stuff from years and years ago come up. And if it doesn't last, well, it probably wasn't good enough anyway. So it wasn't strong enough. It didn't stick hard enough. And so something else will take its place, something more relevant, stickier. And that's how I always felt. So I was a little bit nervous too of this note-taking exercise, because I thought, well, what if I completely screw it up? And then I thought, well, this is what a PhD is for. It's about trying something new and dangerous and difficult and maybe failing, maybe it won't work. And all the way through writing the notes, and again in the thesis, when I've written the essay, I said, I was very conscious. And the me in the novel wandering around there says, well, this is dangerous. I could really mess this up. And she's constantly trying to, make herself efface it. Like every now and again, you see a scene one of the other characters is talking about, and then she comes in and she says, well, I was there, but I refuse to let them talk about me. I've got this gift of being able to, just put myself in the background, so they sort of forget about me because I actually did it. I wrote the thing. And so I'm looking at myself and then writing about myself being in the novel, because you become a character. I become this weird old crone, which, that's a bit of me too. I liked what I became in the novel, this strange old crone. Anyway.
You were rehearsing that too, Isobelle.
Pardon?
If grieving is a rehearsal for your own death, maybe you're rehearsing being an old crone.
Well, I mean, in a way, yes, of course, you experience all those things, but mostly, I think it started out, why I chose death and grieving was because, when I was 14, and that's why, James, I kind of like made a point of saying it was 14 when I started, because my dad was killed in a car accident when I was 14. And for me, that kind of started the whole thing. The novel, the Obernewtyn Chronicles is set after a nuclear holocaust. Most of the world's, radioactive black wastelands. It's all fantasy. It's all science fiction. But for me, I mean, I was writing about my world and my life. My life felt like a nuclear holocaust had happened. I was a misfit. I was lonely. I was getting bashed up at school. I was scared to death of the teachers. we lived in a really tough neighbourhood. My mother went to work and left me alone at night. So all these, you know, and it was a world in which, you know, we played these horrible games, you know, the horror games, but and it was fantasy, but it was a world, we lived in a world in which one day Dad went out and died. So it was a world in which really awful stuff could happen. And we really believed it because it had happened to us. And it was a world where justice, you know, there was no justice because a drunk driver killed my dad and nothing happened to him. You know, he just went off to Queensland, actually, after the trial. My mum told me after the inquest, he said, thank God now I can go to Queensland. And that was what he said at the end of the inquest, where he killed my dad, a man whose wife was in hospital having a baby, and crippled another guy, and nothing happened to him. And I didn't understand that. And funnily enough, I've got a friend who's a solicitor. And while I was writing the novel, I was talking, you know, it's because I was processing. I talk about it in the PhD. I talk about it in the first chapter as one of the driving aspects of all of my writing is, you know, my dad was in an accident 10 years before he was killed. He was in a work accident and the work vehicle ran over his Repco truck and crushed him. And he was terribly scarred on the forehead, and he had one eye he was blind in one eye, but he had a kind of like, it wasn't missing, it didn't look weird, it was just like a cloud was across the middle of his eye. I always thought it was a cloud in his eye somehow. It was very poetic that my dad had a cloud in his eye. And in this accident, he'd become, as you can imagine, he was trapped in the car and he was phobic about cars. So a man with 8 kids rode a motorbike. We never got in a car. He just didn't get in cars. It freaked him out even to get into a bus. And on the night he died, it was the first time in those 10 years that he'd got into a car. And why did he do it? Why did he get in the car? I will never know why he did. And that's another of those questions parents, when they die, or anyone when they die, we're left with questions connected to their life that we can never have answered. So death is this kind of veil of mystery that goes over, and you deal with what's lost, life, and all the stories of that person, and all the connections to you are just severed. All the possibilities of asking those questions are gone. So that's part of what's in the novel, why I was writing the novel. And the novel, throughout the entire, 370,000 page words, it's raining the entire time of the novel. And, Kim, when she read the novel for the first time, she wrote to me, she dreamed about rain afterwards. And Leonie is now reading it. And she told me the other day, guess what I'm reading it with? And I said, I don't know. And she said, I'm listening to a rain tape while she's reading it, which is so apt, so strange. And so I had decided that it was going to be raining for the entire novel. And at some point, Kim said, this is too big. You can't put in a novel this big. And I said, wait a sec, I've got this, exemption. I can write this overlength thing. And Kim said, have you ever heard the term examinable thesis? And I hadn't. And I thought, oh shit. So it was 3 acts. And Kim said, what about, just for the purposes of the PhD, rearranging it into 2 acts and submitting 1 act? So I did. It took me months to find the exact place. And what happened was, she said, just finish it anywhere. And I said, no, it has to feel emotionally satisfying for the examiner. I can't do this unless I reach the end. So I was months overdue. I mean, like, I was already years overdue, but I was months overdue. There's a point beyond which they won't give you any more extensions. And I just thought, well, what are they going to do? I wonder what they'll do, because, I won't do anything. I'll just finish the novel when I finish it. So I just kept going, and no one came after me, and COVID happened. And I thought, well, no one's going to come for me now. So I kept looking for this place where I could write the novel. And when I was writing the character of me, at some point, my character was thinking about, started to think about the fact of my father's death, because in an ethnography, you have to establish positionality. So I thought I wanted my character, the me in the novel, to actually think about why I'd written the novel. So I start to think about my father's death for the first time in some kind of visceral way. And at some point, I said, I start to talk about the fact that, why did my father get into why on that night? It was and I know kind of why. I know that it was a stormy night. He didn't take his bike that day. And then I suddenly thought, oh my God, it was raining. It was raining. That's why he didn't ride his motorbike. That's why he was going to catch a bus. That's why he got into the car when the offer of a lift came. And that's why he died. And I typed, without thinking off the end of my fingers, I typed, maybe all these years, all these books, all I've been trying to do is stop the rain from falling. And that was the moment I decided to end the first act, because it really seemed to me, you know, that was true, what I wanted to say. So that's where I chose to end it and put it in and all the rest of it. So, and the only thing the examiners said, other than I obviously finally handed it in, and no one said anything, and I thought, well, I guess that means it's okay then. And then you have to do a plagiarism check, and I thought, well, the novel will be no problem, but what if I've entirely plagiarized the long essay? Because, you know, that surely, I started to feel it sounded too intelligent, that I must have somehow remembered, even with my crappy memory, I'd somehow remembered huge screeds of stuff. And I was really frightened. I was so scared, because you're supposed to authenticate with your examiner, and I thought, what if I've completely humiliated myself? So I bought a plagiarism checker, and I checked myself first so I wouldn't humiliate myself, and not one single, it didn't flag anything, not a single thing, and you're allowed a certain percentage apparently. So I thought, okay, I've done that, I've got the plagiarism checker, is okay. So I submitted it, and then I waited, and somebody came back and said, you know, I was told by another friend who'd put a PhD in last year that it took 8 months for them to find examiners. And I thought, well, surely people are hanging around doing nothing in COVID, you know, surely somebody's there who could do it, because you don't make much money. I mean, it's a couple of $100 they get for all this work they put into it. So I expected it to wait a long time. And because I skipped those 2 degrees and I don't really know how to do research at that level, I never knew if I was doing the right thing. I never felt, you know, confident. And so there are 3 ways you can be marked with a PhD. And one is, it's just a mark, you pass or fail, but you pass or fail with, you'll know this, Jim, from your dad, I guess, but they pass or fail you with no changes, or with minimal changes, or major changes. And I thought, oh, well, I'll get major changes, and that'll be good, because there are a couple of things I want to fix, and I want to add this story somebody's told me, and I'll be able to work on the novel a bit more, and maybe just ram a bit more of the novel in if I can cut some more, because there's a good bit further down. So I kept my library books, and I kept my notes and everything. And but then when the examiners thing came back, I didn't get any changes. They didn't want any changes. And I thought, oh, well, that's great. And that's a real surprise. And but then it turns out that's kind of unusual. And I didn't know that either. And but the examiner's comments, oh my God, you know, a person can pass with no changes, and it still can be a bloodbath in the comments. And I was frightened of those too. I didn't know who was examining me, because even though you're asked to give some names, I decided that I wouldn't ask, I wouldn't know. And a couple of names I'd given were people I knew, I'd met, who I thought would be good examiners. And so I hadn't communicated with them for 7 years, because I thought that might be illegal or something, or I didn't know what that would mean. So I've written letters to apologise to those examiners for not actually speaking to them for 7 years, because I didn't know if they would be chosen, but I felt like maybe you should just stay away from them. So that's what I did. But they seemed to think that the novel was really good. So I feel that I've actually, you know, I'm going to have to get it down somehow. And in this day and age, you know, am I ever going to get it published? Because my last novel, you know, it was due to come out last month, and they've put it off till next year, and God knows if they'll even really publish it. So I don't know.
It's kind of amusing, really, because for so long, that last novel is that the last Obernewtyn book you're talking about?
Oh, no. That was, no, that's out, James.
Oh, that's out finally, right. That's the one that...
Excuse me, that's several books ago.
All the kids who'd grown old with the Obernewtyn one were still waiting for the last message.
Can I tell you what a good strategy it would have been if it was a strategy? Because do you know what I managed? I managed to have, I had children as readers, and they stayed with me till they were grown up. And now I have grown up readers all ready for this book. if it ever gets
I like
published.
J.K. Rowling in that regard. Can I ask a question? So this, I'm a bit, sorry, I mustn't have been paying attention. So this book that you did for your PhD, is it fantasy as well?
It's realism.
Realism, right.
It's realism. It's about a family who had the youngest child die horribly. And that happens a year before the book begins. And the reason I decided on what appears to be a murder was because I wanted a high level of grief. And in my research, some of the things I wanted to look at happen if death is taken onto a different level. Like there's dealing with the media. There's dealing with strangers who feel they have a right to comment on your grief and on that death. And it's to do with people who don't know the person who died grieving. So it enabled me to deal with different levels of grief and different kinds of grief. So it's realist. It's set in an imaginary but real Australian country town. And the family are basically trying to set up the elder sister decides that she will try. The mother's comatose. She went to see the child, and she hasn't spoken since. She lives, but she doesn't speak. She doesn't function, and she lives a sort of a waking dream, which is part of one of the threads of the story. There's a child who's in a wheelchair who has a condition which is life-threatening. And so he's lived with death his whole life long. So there's all sorts of, levels of, but it's realistic. And the only fantasy that happens is in the dream of the mother who's traveling with a dragon, and she doesn't know what the dragon is, and she doesn't know where she's going, and she doesn't know who she is. And so the dream follows her journey. One of the examiners said she was worried when she read the first 2 chapters of my exegetical essay. The novel is the 3rd chapter. I made it the first. I had to argue to be allowed to do that, and they told me I couldn't, and I decided I wouldn't pay any attention. So I did it anyway because I felt it had to be there, and I couldn't reason with them. So I thought, well, they're not going to look. All those people who make the rules, they're not going to look at it. So I put it where I wanted to put it, and they loved it. The examiners loved how I put it together. I knew it was the right thing to do. And so the first 2 chapters talk about what I'm trying to do. And one of the examiners said, a lot of times when writers try these metatextual tricks, like putting the author in, it's a gimmick and it doesn't work. And I was very conscious that maybe it wouldn't work and I could strip it right out of the novel. But the minute it was in the novel, it grows roots all through your novel. So for better or worse, I realised that it would be really difficult to take it out. The challenge will be to find a publisher who'll let me go with it now. But both those editors loved it. So, I feel much better about it. It wasn't just an experiment. It was something that they felt worked really, really well. So
I don't know if you've ever read or heard Anthony Eaton talk about his book Into White Silence.
Yeah, I read it and I love, I've talked to
you know the meta aspect of that story?
No.
Well, he was actually on one of these Antarctica
yes.
things that you're talking about. And he said that he gets really bad cramps in his legs. And the only way he can relieve the cramps in his legs is by doing a handstand against the wall. And so he was doing a handstand against the wall in the library at whichever hut it was, the research centre there. And as he looked, and because he was doing a handstand, he saw that a book had fallen down the back of the bookcase. And he grabbed it and he thought, imagine if this was something really important that they haven't been able to find yet. So that was when he came up with his idea of the expedition that's gone horribly wrong. But throughout that book, he talks about Imogen, his wife, and he talks about his kids, and he talks about his agent, and he talks about his publisher, and they're all real people, and they're all in that book. And then he talks about doing his handstand against the wall and discovering this book and blah, blah, blah. And his mum totally fell for it. Margaret rang him and said, Anthony Eaton, I did not raise you to steal books from libraries. And he's going, Mum, it's not real. It's all made up. But he's going to do that whole meta thing as well in a sort of slightly different way.
I heard him talk about it, but I thought that everybody listening should enjoy that story too, because it's such a good one. But yeah, I mean, writers are doing it. And in my thesis, I comment on it. Writers are doing it all the time, playing around with, and that's fantasy. And yet they, you know, Into the White Silence was a realistic seeming novel. So from a writer's point of view, I was wanting to talk about these two things as tools and a particular technique I use when I want to write the bits that I think are most affecting in a story. I realised looking back at my body of work, I always use those techniques then. So that's the technique I talk about, you know, in the final part of the thesis.
Do you think that you're, you know, you've talked about dealing with grief and so forth in your earlier books, but they were fantasy books. Do you think there was some kind of arm's length, you know, subconsciously, were you trying to keep an arm's length from reality and dealing with those things through a fantasy lens, or was there something else?
It's this notion of escape, which is, you know, it's seen as it's treated in a derogatory way, the idea of escape, or it's treated as kids should be allowed to escape. But in fact, we all do it all the time. We escape into fantasy. We who have somebody die in our adult lives fantasize that they will come back again. You know, we spend our lives, if we're going to meet somebody or we want to meet somebody, we fantasize about it. So we use this, we will call it visualization, but it's still fantasy. So we use this all the time as a coping mechanism, as a way of stepping back from reality to think. And for me, that escape was like, I mean, for kids, I always talk about Harry Potter's Room of Requirement, because when that appeared in that film, I thought, my God, that's the perfect metaphor for what writing is for me, for me as a kid. It was a place to go where I could think. And for me, you know, I was talking to my old sociology professor who was one of the people who wrote me a reference for doing a PhD in the first place. And I wanted to thank him and I had to track him down. And I said to him, so what are you doing now? And he said, well, I'm dying, I'm old. And I said, Jesus Christ, that's a great way to start a conversation. I said, can you not talk about dying? And he said, well, I am. And I said, yeah, well, we all are. You know, what are you doing? Are you writing anything? And he said, yeah, I'm writing, but, you know, I don't care about publication. I write because I need to process the world. And I thought, that's what I do. That's what writing is for me first. It's a processing of the world. Back to that 14-year-old girl, that was what she was doing. She wasn't wanting to be published. She didn't fantasize about being a writer. She didn't dream about being a writer. She'd never met one in her life. She couldn't imagine she lived in the same universe as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They were shining beings on another planet. You know, the idea that I could actually write to one of those shining beings, be one from that kind of background, no, it never occurred to me at all. For me, that escaping was just simply getting away from this ferocious life that I was living as a kid to be able to think about reality and the world, you know, in a bigger way, and what my place in it was, to think about philosophical ideas. So yeah, I think fantasy can do that, and very often does do that. You know, it's considered to be escapism, but what really are people escaping into? Aren't people who read escaping sometimes into a world where the ideals that we look around desperately to see around us, we see them there. They exist somewhere fictionally for 2 minutes. Therefore, they, you know, I sometimes think if you read a book about courage and it stirs up all sorts of thoughts in your mind, maybe for that minute you could be brave. You know, maybe it does exist while we can imagine it. And so, yeah, for me, that escaping, I don't know, escaping from just the cold face of life to something that means, you know, where I can think, to be able to think.
But what do you make of fantasy writers who are ostensibly from sort of secular humanist or secular socialist democratic societies writing long fantasy books that are really all about putting a king back on the throne? Where does...
Well, again, I think it's the problem with this kind of approach, and there's so much bad fantasy because it's monetized, you know, and there's the problem with that approach is that somebody has decided they'll write fantasy. So first mistake, you put your genre in front of your piece of writing. You don't know what you're going to write. You don't understand what fantasy is if that's how you write fantasy. Writing fantasy for me is not putting the genre there first. Writing fantasy is starting to write something and seeing where it takes you, and whatever receptacle forms around that thing that you're writing that's the right shape. And if you need to go there, well, then go there. You know, whether you write, if you think about genre, it's just a marketing category. Why as writers would we think about a marketing category unless we want to fulfill that marketing category? Why would I say fantasy is this, this, and this therefore I have to fulfill those things. I don't care about those rules about, I broke all those rules when I wrote Darkfall and Darksong, and my editor, who I had educated about fantasy, said to me, Isobelle, you can't do those things. Like when she was given to me as my new editor, I said, well, wait a minute. She said, I don't really like fantasy. I said, okay, before we can do this, I'm going to send you some fantasy and you are going to read it. And then you will then tell me fantasy can't be great. So I sent some things that I loved and I thought were beautifully written. And she said, yes, you're right. They're great. They're fantastic. They're beautiful literature. But I didn't realize she then formulated the rules of fantasy from that. She extrapolated from that. And then she applied them to me. And so I had this book, Darkfall, and every now and again I had a segue to the real world in which someone was just living in some way, but mostly in hopelessness or struggling. It's like a bunch of people in lockdown I was channeling. And she said, Isobelle, you can't make it this real in the middle of fantasy. And I said, why not? And she said, because you can't do that. Either fantasy has got to be fantasy or not. And I said, well, wait a minute. I don't agree. That's not what it is. But I did listen to what she said because it meant I didn't take her with me. If she couldn't want to say that to me, it meant I didn't take her. There must be a reason for it. So trying to find a way, I found another way to encompass that with my watcher, and it brought the novel another level. It lifted it another level for me. So I did listen to what she said, but I didn't agree with her. And, how many, 18 years later, every single day, I still get emails saying, when are you going to write the last one of that series? So tell me it didn't work. It did. It must have. Otherwise, they would have forgot.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to ask Isobelle?
Because we're, I think, nearly out of time.
Just
might need to turn your microphone on if you aren't already on.
Suzanne, you were going to say?
So the novel exists as the parts of it that are submitted to the thesis, the first draft is part of the thesis. So when are you going to pitch it to a publisher? I think it's a time for reading right now. I think the COVID-19 has demanded of us that we engage with literature and television, but still.
Yeah.
Well, we need it.
I have the whole novel. The first half is very heavily worked. The second half, I always write, I write and write and write the beginning over and over to sort of like get up the steam. And then and each loop is deeper into the novel. And then suddenly it takes off. And then I write really fast. And all the wheels have fallen off and the luggage has fallen off and people are jumping out, but I get to the end and it's always tremendously exciting, that last bit, but it really is thin. It needs to be bulked back up and fleshed out, and the beginning needs to be cut and thinned out, and some of the stuff that happens has to go back. So a lot of that's happened in 7 years. A lot of that's happened in the novel already. It does need cutting down. It does need writing. I need an editor to work with to help me to do that. I pitched it, I offered it to one publisher, and she didn't respond for a while. And I said, well, I said, look, I don't care if you like it or not. Can you sell it or not? Because that's all you care about. I told you earlier, James, that I am totally blunt now. I don't say to my publishers, did you like the novel? Because I don't care if they liked it or not, because they don't care if they like it or not. I go to them and I'd say, can you sell this? Because that's all they care about. And I don't care about their literary opinion, because for me, they don't have one unless they offer me one. And then they go up in my estimation. But they're at ground level to begin with. No matter how many years I've known them, I don't expect anything of them. And I'm published, I'm not bitter. I just know how they work after all these years. I don't have any illusions. So I said, here's the novel, publish it or not. Do you want it or not? And I said, I've got other ideas about where to send it. I'm not sure even this is the right publisher for it, but this is my contract. So here it is. And they didn't respond for a while. And I went after and I said, look, I want to withdraw this, either yes or no, just give it back to me. So she said, okay, well, yes, we don't want it then. So that was just before I submitted it. When I submitted it and got the responses from the editors I got back, I suddenly thought, well, wait a minute. So I had it with another editor. I'd sent it to another publisher and I went to her and said, okay, I got a really good response from my from these people, and so I want to send it to another publisher. So yes or no? And she said, well, look, I said, now you haven't read it, have you? And she said, no. I said, right, so you've had 3 months to read it, you haven't read it, so I want it back now. And she said, look, Isobelle, I don't think it's a children's novel. And I said, it isn't a children's novel. I told you that from the very beginning. I said, you will probably have to, you were my portal into the place. I said, send it to who you think it should be sent to. She said, well, I gave it to the acquisitions officer. And I thought, oh God, but she said, the acquisitions officer is someone who loves your writing. And she said, she thinks this is you at your absolute best. She said, she thinks some of the writing is absolutely exquisite, from an acquisitions officer who instantly went up in my estimation. And she said, but it's not it's not a young adult novel. It's an adult literary novel. And I thought, oh, so I said, so what do you want to do? And she said, well, we want to send it to the literary editor, the adult literary. And I said, okay. And I said, but I'm not waiting forever. I said, send it to them, decide, and give it back to me. And I said, I will let you know when I'm sick of waiting, and you make a decision, and then I'm having it back otherwise. So I don't go through agents. I just do it myself, because it's just a longer process, and then they tell you what they think of your novel. What's the use of what they think? The only person that matters now is the editor you're going to work with. And for me, I have to find out if that editor and I can have the same vision of what the novel will be. If an editor says, like one of the editors earlier on it, who saw it very early on it, one of the publishers said, because I needed a letter, I needed a letter to say they were going to publish it. And she said, I love this, but I want you to write it all through the eyes of one character, the kid character. And I thought, well, I know I could write that book, but it's like they look at your book and they get a really good idea for another book from your book. And now they want you to go and write that book. And I said, for Christ's sake, let me write the book I want to write first. And then, if nobody wants it and I want to get it published, maybe I'm going to listen to this. But right now, I'm going to write, because I'm doing a PhD and I'm allowed to. So that PhD gave me such freedom to write this thing. And it was so difficult to write. All those years of writing it, I've never taken so long to write a book before. So, I was lucky. And now they've got it, and maybe they'll publish it or something. I would love it if they would publish it, obviously. I'd love to get it out there.
I like the new Bolshie Isobelle. This is new. I like it.
What was that?
The new Bolshie Isobelle. All those years in,
New
all those
Bolshie.
years in the old
Yeah.
Republic.
Yeah. Well, I think we've run out of time. I've talked you to a standstill. Forgive me if you wanted to ask more questions. He did ask me, and I'm blabby. I told you.
Does anyone have anything to wrap up?
I don't have anything else to say.
I have to say one thing more. When you came to Hamilton, when I was a teacher on exchange there, like in the early 90s, those kids in that town and adults who went to an evening thing too, they'd never met a writer either. And all these writers came into the town, got off the train when the train tracks were still there, and God, here is a writer in our school library. It's just really powerful. Rare opportunities, especially in those days for kids.
It was very special because they were doing a whistle-stop tour to places that hadn't had passengers for years and years. Some places, the entire town with the mayor in mayoral robes and kids singing with banners turned out to meet the train. Oh my God, it was such fun. And then they just carried us all off in different directions. Pardon?
Which Hamilton are we talking about?
Hamilton, Victoria. It's near the South Australian border, near the Grampians.
And those kids, not every kid sees writers, or city kids do. They're so blasé about you. You have to deal with them one way. But kids from country towns, they're completely different, a different way. The least relevant I ever found myself in my life was doing a 40-day and 40-night tour I had decided to do to Central Australia and go to schools where there were Indigenous kids. God, did I ever feel completely irrelevant? I didn't know, nothing I said seemed to I didn't know how to engage. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to hear from them, but they were so shy and I was so weird. And I just, I was the wrong person, and I would have done anything to get into it, but being there one person for 1 hour wasn't enough, I'd love to do that again somehow, someday, in a different way. I just don't know what that way would be. Anyway, you've all got a life to go to. I'm going to go and watch Bearus in The Great Escape now.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Hey,
thanks,
James,
Isobelle. Really appreciate it. So thanks, everyone.
James, before you go, can you just tell me a little bit more about, what is this Kitten Club? Because I've never done this one before and I don't know what it's all about.
Okay, so the Kitten Club, it's called, hang on, I'm just going to take my mute off properly. Hang on a tick. All right, so the reason it's called Hemingway's Polydactyl Kitten Club and Speakeasy is because Ernest Hemingway had a bit of a thing for cats with extra toes. If you go to Hemingway's house in Florida, you'll find all these cats with extra toes, polydactyl kittens, and they're all descendants of Hemingway's cats. They were also called sailor cats because the argument went, or the theory went, that they had the extra toes so they were able to grip the deck better. But we just thought it was Hemingway. It just sort of sounded cool. And the venue that we first started running it in, which we haven't been able to do since COVID, is the Avalon Cocktail Bar, which looks a little bit like the picture behind me, but actually a bit sort of Katoomba shabby chic. And so we just called it that because it was kind of quirky. And so now it's just become the Kitten Club. But we don't call the people who come along regularly, we don't call them the Kitten Clubbers because that just sounds wrong. We don't endorse animal cruelty. So we're just the polydacts or but anyone's welcome. You're always welcome. Usually it used to be an in-person thing and there were lucky door prizes and the rest, but it's actually been good having the online thing because we've been able to get people in who we wouldn't have been able to have. Like I'm doubtful that Isobelle would have made the drive down from Brisbane to Katoomba.
Yeah. Right. Now I know what it's like. I might actually visit.
The original idea was that it was going for 2 hours, and the way it worked was that the first half hour or so was people doing open mic, just sort of reading stuff they'd written or poems they liked, or just talking. And no slam, although no one could really define what slam was, but we said there was not to be any of that. And no open mic guitar, singer-songwriter stuff, because there's other places that do that. And then the middle half hour or so or 40 minutes was for the guest to talk and take questions and chat and read and whatever. And we had Stephen Herrick, we had Kate Fagan, we had Mark Tredinick, we've had Toby Riddle, a whole bunch of other people. And then the end of it was more sort of open mic stuff. And it was really nice and we were really enjoying doing it, but it just sort of all
Let me know when there's another one on, James.
Sorry?
Let me know when there's another one on.
First Monday of the month, every month. I'll put you on. I'll put you on the. How did you find out about it, Jenny?
I'm on the mailing list for WestWords.
Oh, right, okay.
And I just like to keep my eyes on what other, organisations are doing.
Yeah.
She doesn't have enough time on. I'm going to go because I need to watch that Australian short stories. I need to see.
All right. Thanks so much, Isobelle. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isobelle.
And James, I was interested in, meeting Curly a little bit. That was one of the reasons was I've sort of seen little snippets of her and people have recommended her, but I've never actually sort of had a chance. So. Well,
she was meant to do it a couple of months back and she couldn't make it, and then she couldn't make it again this time. So we're hoping third time lucky, but we'll keep you in the loop. She's lovely.
Yeah. I tried to invite her up to Ipswich for a poetry feast workshops in schools, but she wasn't available. And yeah, right. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Kendi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone. Thanks, Jenny. See you later. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.